Good afternoon, everyone. This is Bethany Hawkins, and I'm Chief of Operations for the American Association for State and Local History that was based in Nashville, Tennessee. I am also privileged enough to sit on the TAM board as conference chair. So I'm glad that you're here with us for this morning's keynote session with Susie Wilkening. We will be taking questions at the end of Susie's presentation. Please put those into the Q&A box on the Whova app. You may have to exit out or minimize your screen. I believe it's minimize your screen to be able to see that. But I will be monitoring the Q&A throughout the presentation. And so go ahead and put your question there, and then we'll bring them to Susie at the end of the session. Now it is my pleasure to introduce you to Susie Wilkening. Susie has over 20 years of experience in museums, including 15 years leading custom projects for museums, as well as fielding groundbreaking national research on the role of museums in American society. Susie enjoys sharing her findings at various annual meetings, including the American Alliance of Museums, the American Association for State and Local History, Association of Science Technology Centers, Association of Children's Museums, and other state and regional meetings. Susie is a go-to expert on museums for the media, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Fast Company, NPR, and others. Additionally, she is the author of Audiences and Inclusion, a primer for cultivating more inclusive attitudes among the public, and is the primary author of Life Stages of the Museum Visitor. Susie earned her BS in History, Technology, and Society from Georgia Tech, and an MA from the Winnetou program in Early American Culture at the University of Delaware. She resides in Seattle, and her husband and curious children often accompany her as she travels to various museums and historic sites. And we are thrilled to have Susie with us. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off my audio and video, and Susie, you just take over.
Oh, thanks so much, Bethany, and thank you all of you for inviting me to join you today. So as an audience researcher, I'm constantly trying to assess how societal shifts are affecting our visitors. And the past year and a couple of weeks, we've seen some pretty big shifts. COVID, George Floyd and shifting attitudes towards inclusion. There was an election. And all of these things affect whether museum goers are comfortable visiting museums, or even if museums are open to visit, as well as their attitudes as they approach the content you share. Do they perceive it as not inclusive enough? Or do they perceive it as too inclusive? There's a lot going on. So today there's two things I want to explore with you and make sure you know how to keep up with ongoing research so you can keep getting informed about these big things. First, we're going to talk a little bit about the pandemic and how it's affecting our visitors with a quick update. And then we're going to talk about a little bit about inclusion and their attitudes around inclusion. So first, the pandemic. Last April, just when we were kind of realizing that the pandemic wasn't a let's stay home for a few weeks and things will get better kind of thing, AM and I decided to be nimble. And we had just fielded the annual survey of museum goers. It had just ended perfect collection January and February, right before the pandemic hit. We just fielded that, and we had a large number of people who were willing to participate in follow-up research. And we said, we need to do this. So we went right back into the field immediately to field a qualitative panel. So a qualitative panel is where I get a bunch of people together. In this case, is about 160 to begin with, in a secure online space. And I ask them really tricky, kind of big, hard questions. Not too many questions, but hard ones. And they share their thoughts with me. So we quickly pivoted. We put together what I refer to as the pandemic panel. So we could keep track of how visitors or potential visitors were feeling as we went through this pandemic. So just over 160 people joined us last spring. And that panel has remained open for the past year. Every 3 months, I check in with our panelists, see how they're doing, and pose a question or two or three to them. So even though it's been about the about the pandemic, we've talked about a lot of other things in the past year. We've talked about George Floyd. We've talked about race. We've talked about the events on January 6th, because those were all things that were coming to the surface over the past year. So everything we've learned from that pandemic panel, we've been sharing over the past year through infographic data stories. And those data stories have varied in topic over the past year. Some of them now already feel rather dated. Should we wear masks or not? It's hard to say. That was a big one about a year ago. And now it's obvious. Okay, yes, masks have been important. Some of them feel a little bit dated now already, but some of them are still, coming out with new ones. And I want to go through two of the newest ones that have just come out from this winter, share those with you, get a sense of how people are feeling, and then we're going to move on to talk about a little bit more about inclusion and that inclusive primer. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So I work a lot with infographics. I find that they're really helpful to use. All of the infographics I'm going to be showing you today, you can download easily off of my website. So I'll show you how to do that before the end of the session. So you can go find all of them and download to your heart's content. But this infographic came out just a few weeks ago. Back in January, I checked in with the pandemic panel and I just said, how are you doing? We had picked up in fall that emotions were getting really low, and anticipating that this winter there were going to be very low emotions again. And that's indeed what we found. So back in January, this winter of our discontent was the kind of feeling that a lot of the panelists had. They felt like a bit like they were experiencing that movie Groundhog Day, which we've all talked about in the past year. And our lives are on repeat. Everything's changed, but nothing has changed. And we asked them what were their concerns. And they were concerned a lot about pandemic fatigue. And I think a lot of us have that concern. And a lot of us are experiencing it and having both of those emotions at the same time. There were a lot of concerns about mental health. They're mostly thinking about through the lens of their own experiences as adults. But some of them were also talking about mental health issues with children. Here in Washington State, we declared a new state of emergency about mental health in children, trying to get schools reopened. So this is like a percolating issue across the board here for all Americans. And there are growing and increasing concerns about community, talking about, of course, people whose jobs have been lost, people who, the economic ramifications of the pandemic on small businesses, but also thinking about how our community and our social fabric, as we see down here, maybe have some rips in it, some tears in it, and how are we going to mend that and put that back together again once we can be together in places once again. Back in January, they were really concerned about variants that were kind of unknown. I mean, I think that's still a valid concern, but it feels like the vaccines are helping with that. So it's hard to really say how that's going to play out. But it seemed to be a bigger concern back in January than it feels already now back in March. And in January, they were really rattled by the events of January 6th. And so it was kind of coming in as a new layer of worry and concern. So it was just like this piling up of worries and stressors and these lives of museum goers. And of course, we all experience it as well, because we're human and we're facing these things too. So, our own experience is pretty much validated by what we're seeing with museum goers. So was there any hope in this winter of our discontent? And there was. Back in January, people were, just starting to get those vaccinations out, and they were being inspired by seeing people get vaccinated. They were inspired by each other getting vaccinated, getting those first vaccines back in January. So that was a really big thing that was starting to come through. And they also talked about other little things that gave them hope, like ukulele lessons, or we find our way to bakeries far too often than we should. So they're finding these little things too, just to kind of feed themselves with, physically and metaphorically. So those small indicators, I think we are seeing playing out. And as we went through February and into March, I think that a lot of people are starting to feel a little bit more hopeful now. We're getting into warmer weather, more and more people are getting vaccinated. So hopefully what we're going to see in April is some improved mental health, some improved optimism, but people still also increasingly feeling safer going out and being in public places. That's the hope. Okay, so about going out into those public places, how are people feeling about that? So we wanted to find out about vaccinations. So here we're mixing up a few different data sources. First, the pandemic panel. So we're going to talk about that. But first, in the data story, we went into the field quantitatively as well. Excuse me. I did a broader population sample to find out in January how the broader population of US residents felt about going to public places, indoor spaces. So it could be museums, it could also be concert halls, it could be, I forget what the other things I mentioned in the question. But like, how comfortable do you feel? You know, do you feel comfortable now? Is it going to be after you're vaccinated? Or are you going to have to wait till herd immunity to feel comfortable in those spaces? So that was the question back in January, the broader population. We used the exact same question in the 2021 annual survey of museum goers to see how museum goers were responding to that question. That question came out about a month, 6 weeks later. It was being fielded mostly in February and early March. This is brand new, fresh data. So over 40,000 museum goers, actually it's over 50,000 now because we've had some more since we developed the infographic, but the numbers haven't changed. Asked that question 2 different times, different samples. Keep that in mind. And we had, you know, from our panelists, some representative comments of those 3 categories. You know, people who already feel comfortable, you know, they have confidence in what you're doing that keep them safe when they visit. Or I will be at museums with bells on once vaccinated. As a matter of fact, I'll be everywhere with bells on. So we have these really kind of funny comments too, like, I'm ready, I'm going to get out there. And then we have that herd immunity, a little bit more cautious approach, saying, I love museums so much, but I'm not going to be coming back until there's herd immunity. What we saw with those numbers, though, if we look at this, the brown across the top, that's the US residents back in January, is we found about a quarter of US residents said they were comfortable now going to these places. 17% said once they were vaccinated, they'd be comfortable. They didn't have to wait for herd immunity. And 48%, so half of respondents back in January say, I'm going to wait until we have herd immunity. Mostly I'm vaccinated and herd immunity, but there were a few people who were saying they weren't going to be vaccinated, but they were still going to wait for herd immunity. So big threshold herd immunity. Half back in January. But with the museum goers, just 6 weeks later, it shifted. The feel comfortable now didn't really budge. But what we see is more and more comfort with the idea of going out once you're vaccinated, and fewer saying we're going to wait until there's herd immunity. And so as people see others getting vaccinated, as they get vaccinated themselves, they're feeling more confident. Whether it's misplaced confidence or valid confidence, it's hard to say right now. But right now they are starting to feel more confident, because I don't think that museum goers are less risk averse than the broader population. In fact, I would say they're probably more risk averse. I think there's a shift that's happened here. But nevertheless, there's still a sizable number of museum goers who are saying, I'm going to hold off, I'm going to wait until herd immunity. So it's going to be a slow process still for bringing back all of our audiences and having them all feel safe visiting indoor spaces once again. So long process, but may not be as long as we thought it was going to be, as long as the vaccinations continue and variants are held off. There was another piece that we wanted to ask. So this is just within the pandemic panel. We did not ask this in our surveys. And that was the idea of having to show proof of vaccination for entry into certain public spaces. It's something that airlines have talked about, countries have talked about, but also tourist destinations like resorts and spas have talked about, concert venues have talked about. I haven't really heard museums talk about it, but possible. So we said, like I said, well, how do you feel about this? What do you think about the idea of having to show proof of vaccination to come in to a place like a museum? And responses varied really widely. We had, you know, a very, what I would say, politically conservative kind of response, like this is overreach. It goes against our freedoms guaranteed by our Constitution. So bringing out that kind of defensive mechanism of the Constitution, you know, okay. And then we have a more safety conscious approach, I guess you could say, saying, this is like actually a great idea, because then I'd have confidence that I was being taken care of, that I was going to be safe, that the staff was going to be safe. This is a really good idea for public health. And if people want to go to these places, then maybe it'll inspire them to get vaccinated too. There were some more nuanced responses as well, though. There were people who were concerned about those who really couldn't get vaccinated. They were like, oh, we need to make sure we wait. If this happens anywhere, it needs to be once vaccines are widely available. Otherwise, it's discriminatory. And then there was also this response from a young African-American woman who's, kind of saying, I could see how that would be great, but it also could be classist and ableist, and to really think through the ramifications of such a policy. Now, I don't know of any museums actually considering this, but it's still useful information to know, to feel how people are responding to this kind of question. The way the conversation went was so much like the conversation on masks back last April and May, when it was just a battle over masks, and still is in some places. It was a lot like that, but it may be moot, because given the increasing levels of comfort people are having going out once they themselves are vaccinated, it may not be that anybody's demanding this in the first place either. So kind of keep an eye on that conversation. You kind of have some sense of how it's playing out. Not something we're saying that you need to do, but just be aware of at this moment, because it is a conversation that's happening in some other types of organizations. So we're going to resample as needed on the whole vaccinations and feeling safe on reentry over the next few months. So stay tuned, and maybe we'll have some more updates later in the spring on that one. Okay, now we're going to shift gears. The other piece I wanted to talk about today is inclusion. So a big shifting of gears to a very big topic that's been on a lot of our minds over the past year or more, and looking at how people feel about inclusive content in museums specifically. One of the things I've been looking at over the past few years is attitudes around inclusive history in particular, but also just around inclusive content in general, and how different museum goers respond to inclusive content in museums. Thinking about how there's two sides to the coin for doing inclusive work. One is the broadening of audiences to be inclusive of anyone who wants to visit the museum. But the other side of the coin is one that we don't seem to talk about as much. And that's thinking about and considering the role that museums play in helping develop inclusive attitudes among people who may not otherwise be that inclusive. Is there a role that we can play in helping people who are anti-inclusive, or people who don't think much about inclusion one way or the other, and helping cultivate and develop more inclusive attitudes among them so that we have a more inclusive society? So that was something I kept kind of coming back to and looking at and examining in my research over the past few years, and ended up developing with AAM this primer on how do we do that? How do we think about how we can cultivate those inclusive attitudes? So we have some comments here already starting off. Is there space among the woke for the still waking? And a survey respondent who said, it's easy to imagine that whether a presentation is considered revisionist or revealing might differ substantially depending on the viewer's background and willingness to consider different viewpoints. That's really important. And all of you who are working in history in particular probably have had this experience at your museum where your content has been responded to in very emotionally different ways. By going, oh, I didn't know that, versus that is revisionist history, and it can be the same thing. Different attitudes coming into that experience, responding in very different ways. That's what I'm looking at and picking apart. Okay, so what do we do? I'm going to give you a really brief walkthrough of this primer. There is a way for you to download it. I'm going to tell you at the end how to do that so you can get your own copy. But we're going to go through some of this so you can get a sense of what's there. First, there is a ton of research that went into putting this together. Over the past few years, surveying over 60,000 US residents, mostly museum goers, but not all, and then having over 500 people participating in those kinds of panels like I talked about with the pandemic. We're asking really hard questions. And I'm getting almost like essays in response. One of the things that's really important to do is to acknowledge my own bias going into a project like this and my own lived experiences and how it's affecting how I approach this content. I'm pretty liberal. I think inclusion is a great thing. So I'm coming out from that perspective. But I had to really work hard to mitigate my own biases as I looked through and sifted through and analyzed and internalized thousands and thousands of comments from museum goers who did not share my views and values and viewpoints, and making sure I was representing them fairly. So I did a few different things here. You can read this for yourself when you download your own copy, to really think about that and be thoughtful about it. Okay, so there's 4 big parts of the primer. We're going to kind of skip over that middle section, open minds, because you can read that part for yourself, but I want to make sure we get to the parts that are most important. Okay, so let's think about inclusion. American attitudes towards inclusion are divided, they're complicated, they're super messy. Emotions, values, identity are all key parts of it. And that's a big obstacle for getting towards a truly just and equitable society. So first thing that we did is we went to other different national research studies to say, okay, what's the lay of the land? Where do Americans feel about these things? All these data points go back to either the Pew Research Center or PRRI. I think there's one other one in here. They're all footnoted in the actual document that you can download. But these are all reputable, nonpartisan research organizations. And this is what they've been finding over the past about 2 years. That 39% of US adults say there's discrimination against men in our society. Just a third of registered voters in the US think white people benefit a great deal from advantages in society that Black people don't have. Just a third. Almost half, about 44% of white Americans think discrimination against white people has become as big a problem as discrimination against Black Americans and other minorities. Half of Americans describe immigrants as a burden to local communities. And nearly half of white people say a majority non-white population will weaken American culture. So what about museum goers? How do they feel about inclusion? I'm going to have a pet moment for a second because my dog is going to start barking outside my office door if I don't let her in. Let me grab her. Come on, Macy. There she is. Okay. Thank you for letting me do that. Okay, so what about museum goers and how do they feel? It's a spectrum. There's a spectrum of values, attitudes, and beliefs around inclusion among our museum goers. The good news is about 41% is our estimate of museum goers, people who visit museums regularly, do want inclusive content from museums. That's not even half. It is twice as many people as who we would call anti-inclusive, which is we're estimating around 18%. So anti-inclusive would mean that they are saying, no, don't talk about that stuff. They might be the ones who are visibly objecting, and when they come into your museum to anything that they view as inclusive and maybe threatening to white identity, for example. They can be as extreme as neo-Nazis and white nationalists, or they could just be that comment that you're getting saying, no, I disagree with that. That's revisionist history because, and go on from there. So we're estimating about 18% in that anti-inclusive category. But that also means that there is this big group here. This is what, 26, 36%, a little over a third of museum goers who are what we call that status quo group. Generally, it means they're not seeking inclusive content and they're not rejecting it either. Within that status quo group, though, there are some who are leaning more inclusive and some who are leaning less inclusive. But this is a group that we can really think about really carefully because they're not outright rejecting inclusive content, How do we bring them along with us? How do we present inclusive content in ways that are calibrated to engage them, engage with their emotions, engage with their empathy, and bring them along with us into a more inclusive attitude? That's the focus of this primer, because that really matters. Our research is also consistently showing that the broader population is actually more likely than museum goers to want museums to be inclusive. And of course, being inclusive, in my opinion, and that I have many others, is the morally right thing to do. It's the morally right thing to do, and it also appears to be the long-term path to audience growth, since there are more people out there wanting museums to be inclusive. So how do we do that? How do we mainstream inclusive content in ways that bring along that status quo group along with us and into a more inclusive mindset? So we're going to explore that in this primer. Here are some representative comments from those extremes that we talked about, that spectrum. We saw anti-inclusive comments that were just very out there, very blunt, as you will see here. We saw status quo comments. They're kind of saying neutrality is actually a great idea, because then it doesn't, then we can think about and decide for ourselves. That tends to be a very status quo type comment. Even though we in the field talk a lot about museums are not neutral, a lot of our audiences perceive us as neutral places, and that we should be neutral. There's a tension there that we have to think about, process, adapt to, adjust to, address, and move on with. So that status quo group tends to think of us as neutral. That's a good thing. How do we work with that? And then we have those inclusive viewpoints that say, this is what museums need to be doing, and they have things to make up for in the past even sometimes. How do people get to those attitudes in the first place? I mean, we are all influenced by a wide variety of forces that get us to where we have our own idiosyncratic set of values, attitudes, and beliefs. So it's socioeconomic status, ethnicity, gender, upbringing, education, religion, race, social network, and more. All of those things influence where we tend to fall in that spectrum of inclusive attitudes. So we end up looking at the spectrum and thinking about it in terms of how do people cluster? Where do those values, attitudes, and beliefs tend to cluster together? And how do we think about them as museum practitioners? So we end up talking a lot about what we call a traditional cluster of values, attitudes, and beliefs, and the people who tend to have those, versus what we are calling a more neoteric cluster of values, attitudes, and beliefs, and what those things are that tend to cluster together and what those people tend to value. There is a middle, but most people lean one way or the other. So thinking about that traditional cluster, these are values, attitudes, and beliefs that tend to go together, but not always. So somebody can have a lot of these, but not every single one. But it tends to be politically and socially conservative, actually somewhat less engaged with museums and culture, as in they might not be visiting as often. Generally less engagement with their community and broader world than what we see with the neoteric cluster. They tend to be, when it comes to inclusion, that status quo group or non-inclusive or anti-inclusive. People who fall in this traditional cluster overwhelmingly much more likely to say that museums should be neutral and never take a position. They tend to have a traditional, often celebratory approach to history and to their own culture. They take pride in the past and their own cultural heritage. When it comes to patriotism, there are what we call blind patriots who might say something like, America is the best country ever, full stop. That kind of blind patriotism is the official term for it. Somewhat less curious. We're going to skip over a lot about curiosity in this primer because you can read it for yourself. When we get to that, I'll explain why that matters. Demographically, tend to be older, more likely to be male, and tend to have a little bit lower levels of educational attainment, but not always. So keep that in mind. That neoteric cluster, these are the things that tend to cluster together, these values, attitudes, and beliefs. politically and socially more liberal, somewhat more engaged with museums and culture, visit more often. Generally, more engagement with the community and the broader world. They tend to be much more inclusive, but there are some people in the status quo group who feel who fall into this group as well because of the other traits. Much more likely to say that museums can take an evidence-backed position. They have what we refer to as an additive approach to history and culture. You add on all these different layers. They're more curious about other cultures and worldviews. They're just more curious in general. And demographically tend to be younger, more likely to be female, and have a little bit higher levels of educational attainment. But here's a big thing. You take this is like a big thing to take away from this because it's so important. Don't make assumptions. It is super tempting to use these trait clusters I just went through, especially the demographic ones, to make assumptions about individual visitors. Don't do it. You have to actually talk to that visitor, understand where they're coming from before you can make any kind of assumption. So here we have a young woman who was saying, you know, the docent assumed I felt a certain way because of my age or gender, and that's been really unpleasant. So you can have younger women who are people of color, who are actually traditional. And you can have an older white male, like my 95-year-old stepfather, who is as neoteric as you can get. Just don't make assumptions. While these general clusters go together, everybody's going to be different. And you need to think about that as well. So it's just going back and forth, thinking broadly about your audience, understanding these clusters, and then thinking about the individual visiting your museum when they walk in the door differently. Okay. So all that, laying that in mind, the next section of the primer, which I'm going to go through really quickly because I know, let's see, we have about 15 more minutes. And I want to get to the 10 steps for helping with inclusive attitudes. This is just going to give you a sense of what's there. Basically, in a nutshell, the more curious somebody is, the more inclusive they are. And you can read this when you download the primer for yourself. So here's the data on it. There's lots of quotes. It talks about childhood. It talks about constraints and how curiosity during childhood really matters for growing up in those inclusive attitudes and also for just thrive. And then it talks about adults and engaging their curiosity as well, and all the outcomes that curiosity can bring you, including around inclusive attitudes. But how does it play out here? So we're just going to go with curiosity is a great thing. Curiosity drives more inclusive attitudes. We're going to just run with that. The neoteric cluster generally has higher levels of curiosity. The traditional cluster tends to have lower levels of curiosity. And a lot of it is about comfort with discomfort and comfort or being comfortable with those different perspectives and not being challenged by them. So we're going to lay out how that plays out. When we have museum goers coming into museums through that lens of curiosity, the traditional cluster participants and visitors tend to be more self-interest driven. They're looking for things to that they're already interested in. Whereas somebody who's more neoteric is seeking to broaden their worldview. So exposed to new things and being challenged. Those are very different motivations for going to a museum. The traditional cluster tends to say things like, just give me the facts and I will make up my own mind. That is like a direct quote that I get over and over and over. From the neoteric perspective, it's more, they're comfortable with that conflicting truths, ambiguity. Just facts doesn't really convey truth. And seeing that it's a little bit more complicated than that. That traditional perspective, it's much more likely to seek identity and or values validation when they visit a museum. And so then they have these comments like this one, I want to contemplate the situation based on my own worldview without being blasted with political correctness on every front, including museums. So she wants to kind of come in with her own worldview and validate that. That neoteric perspective is more about seeking growth and expanded thinking. That's interesting. We need to fix this slide. I never noticed this slide has a typo. This should not be interest driven on this slide. This is my first time taking the slide deck out for a ride. So we're going to fix that. It shouldn't be interest driven there. It should be something about not wanting to be challenged by new content that challenges their worldviews and perspectives. So yeah, don't be neutral. Don't challenge me. There are enough organizations taking positions. Don't let that happen in the museum. It should be a sanctuary for knowledge and beauty. We tend to see that from art museum visitors and botanical garden visitors. Can't you just be a place of beauty? Why do you have to bring the politics in here? This is the kind of comments that we get. That more neoteric perspectives is more comfortable with that idea of being challenged, and to experience intellectual discomfort is not necessarily a bad thing. And that by massive factor, they're more likely to appreciate that from museums. It shouldn't just be a safe place, it should be a challenging place. And then we have that neutral, don't tell me how to think, versus museums take a position that shouldn't take a position, and that neutral reinforces white heteronormative perspectives. So again, all 5 of these is where we have conflicting viewpoints, conflicting approaches that are banging up against each other and causing tension, and how people are going to be responding to your content based on how they perceive it, whether they're coming from that traditional cluster and it's going against what they see, or they're maybe coming from that neoteric cluster and maybe they're not seeing enough there that they think is inclusive. So we have this tension. It's a really difficult landscape, and it's really hard to calibrate what you're doing to try to address and mainstream inclusion while bringing along this traditional perspective that may be fighting that in the first place or resisting it. It's all about when those defense mechanisms come up, and how do you address those defense mechanisms? Okay. What about the status quo or the messy middle? Those are different terms for it, but the people who kind of fall in the middle, not seeking inclusive content, not rejecting it either, that's again what we see as a great opportunity for bringing more inclusive content in ways that they can internalize and then move forward with. So we have to do that at what we call the speed of trust. As long as they trust us to be providing that content, they're going to move along with us. It's about pacing. But what we end up seeing right now is a curiosity gap. There's some seeking understanding and inclusion, others seeking validation for their in-group. So this is a polarization on curiosity. It's a polarization on inclusive attitudes, and it reflects the political polarization we all see today. We see this in external data from Pew Research Center and PRRI, where we see very different attitudes around race and inclusion based on political persuasion. And we see it in our own data. So this is from the research that we've been doing over the past few years. When we do ask political persuasion in our research, we're finding very different attitudes based on political persuasion and identity, with people who self-identify as somewhat or very liberal, much more likely to have inclusive attitudes than those who identify as somewhat or very conservative. However, still within each political group, it's still a spectrum. So while nearly 40% of conservatives we would actually put in the anti-inclusive category, there's still 14 to 19% that are more on that inclusive side as well. So that's really important to think about, because while somebody might be coming into your museum that is conservative, you still cannot assume anything about that one person, because they may fall anywhere on this spectrum. And the same thing is true about liberals. While yes, the majority of liberals tend to be much more inclusive in their attitudes, we still have some who are anti-inclusive. So again, don't make those assumptions. You understand this broad trend, but that individual standing in front of you may buck that trend. But this is similar to what we see here, where it's not, these political groups are not monolithic within themselves. It's more complicated, but overall, we see different trends for conservatives versus liberals. So what's driving a lot of this, the anti-inclusive sentiment? It's a lot of fear. There's so much fear written into those comments. It's fear for their own belief systems. It's a threat to the understanding of the world. It's feels a threat to their own customs and culture and their own identity, and wanting to make sure that that identity preservation is still there. Now, on the flip side of that, it's also the more inclusive attitudes are, well, what about all those identities and customs and beliefs we haven't respected and honored in the past? We were trying to lift those up as well, right? But that's perceived as a threat by those who see that as in place of their own cultures and not with. So it's how do we frame it? How do we contextualize it? How do we calibrate it so that we can mainstream that inclusive content in ways that's not rejected by those who are less inclusive? I just said all that basically. One of the things I find really useful to think about this is to think about this in terms of what's called intuitive epistemology. It helps me wrap my brain around this. I love this concept. There's a whole book about this. It's really boring. Don't go read it. But here's the important part to know about this. Intuitive epistemology is a process and study of establishing facts that acknowledges how individuals their values and life experiences deeply affect the questions they ask of a subject and thus the answers that they find. So this is how you can have two people go through the exact same exhibit or the exact same experience and walk out of it having drawn radically different conclusions based on facts. It's because they're finding different facts to answer their questions and walking off and not considering the other stuff. That's just noise. It's a kind of a nice way of saying cherry picking, and we all do it. All of us, all the time. I do it. I have to really fight it in myself because I do it all the time. I want to validate my opinions. So therefore, I'm going to pick what supports my opinions and ignore this other stuff. Usually what happens is they just ignore the other stuff, but if the other stuff is really in their face, they might get really angry. So I hear about this a lot from one of my clients, which is Monticello, where people come in wanting to hear how great Thomas Jefferson is, right? So they might be coming with this viewpoint. Thomas Jefferson's great. How did he write that? It was amazing documents. And then they hear about Sally Hemings and they feel like that, it's about tearing down Thomas Jefferson. They get really angry. That's when they get angry because it's in their face. And then we start hearing about you're, pushing, this bad information down my throat and I don't appreciate it. We get that visceral defensive response. And this is how intuitive epistemology plays out, because they're looking for different facts about Thomas Jefferson than perhaps somebody who walks in going, how did he write those documents while also enslaving 600 men, women, and children? How do you reconcile that? That's a different approach. They're going to find different facts. So thinking about this and how people find different facts and walk away with those different facts is really helpful to understand how people's brains work. So as I said here, it's how they approach a single topic and come to radically different conclusions. And so that's why we don't agree on facts. It's why the majority of us in this country say, when it comes across different political parties, why we can't agree even on basic facts, because we're picking different facts that support our worldviews. So when we have these dueling facts, it's hard to change people's minds. You cannot, bombarding them with more facts is not going to do it. They're going to cherry pick. They're going to practice that intuitive epistemology. So you can't change their minds based on facts. You have to change the questions they're asking in the first place. And if you can help them change their questions, and if they're developing new questions on their own based on that experience with you, that actually feels really good to them, because then it's about their own process and the respect that people are receiving themselves as thoughtful people who can analyze stuff and think through and ask questions. It fits into a very highly desired pattern of museum engagement, especially for more traditional visitors. Museums should present facts. Let me make up my own mind. We're helping them reframe their questions, And then we're asking them to share that back with us. That feels really good to people. But there's more to inclusive practice than asking good questions. We have to also expand the number of people who have those inclusive attitudes. And that means we as practitioners have to deploy radical curiosity and courageous empathy in our practice. So we can strive to understand all of these different worldviews as they walk in our door, know about these overall patterns, think about people as individuals, and then anticipate how to deal with different responses to inclusive content that we are mainstreaming and sharing with the public. That is not easy. I don't envy y'all that task. I'm the researcher. I get to sit in my office down here in the basement and talk about this, and this is what they're saying, but I don't have to be that front line. Y'all are. I don't envy you the task. I'm going to try to make it as easier as possible as we can. Okay. One thing also to keep in mind is that we as a field tend to be much more inclusive than where the broader population is and where museum goers are. So how do we bridge that gap and think about that? Okay. We're going to do 10 steps super quick, and I'm going to show you where you can find everything to download, and then we're going to still have a few minutes for Q&A. We can do this. Okay. So 10 steps primer of inclusive practice. This is what the research says to do. Number 1, acknowledge your bias in the beginning and then encourage your visitors to do likewise. So remember back at the beginning of this particular slide deck, I had a bias statement, didn't I? That was in there really deliberately. It's good practice, but also lets you know where this is coming from and what I'm trying to do to address my biases so that I can be fair. You don't have to be as blatant as I was about a bias statement. There's more subtle ways of sharing biases and then acknowledging them than what I did, but it's also really important to do. What I also found is that among museum goers, if you ask them about their biases and frame it as we're all human, we have biases, what are your biases? Virtually all of them will admit that yes, they have biases. They're human, that's how we are function. So acknowledge and encourage your visitors to do so as well. Put them into that mindset of we're all biased, let's all think about this. Okay, step 2, reinforce aspirational identity, that they're a curious person. They're open-minded, they're a well-rounded individual. That tends to put people into that mindset where they're going to be more receptive to content that they may not have been expecting in the first place. They're going to want to live up to that aspirational identity of, yes, of course I'm a curious person. So your visitors are curious and they're open-minded, and reinforce that with them. Spark curiosity. There's 2 different kinds that are in this primer. You can read them earlier, but spark curiosity to help them want to find those new things and maybe come to those unexpected conclusions. Once that curiosity is sparked, engage in dialogic questions. That's where you're trying to help them develop new questions that maybe they hadn't considered before. Consider this is a phrase that works really well. And so as you're working to help reframe questions, consider this. How would you feel if? It's a way of softening and then opening minds to consider something different. And practice courageous empathy by being open to their answers. Okay, so now they're curious, they're in that curious mindset, they're open mindset, they've developed some new questions. That's when you start sharing the facts with them. Because now they need to practice that intuitive epistemology, right? To answer those new questions. Well, now you're going to provide those facts that they weren't expecting to answer those questions. So it's all those facts. So that's multiple perspectives. It's telling the truth even when it changes our understanding of the past or of different cultures of others, and trusting our audiences with all those facts. They want the facts, give them the facts. Show your work. If you want them to trust you with that content, especially if it's a different content than they were expecting, show your work. That means footnotes and exhibitions. It means footnotes and anything you're doing online. It means as a program saying, if you would like a list of resources that we consulted to develop this program, this is where to find it. I don't care if nobody goes to find that bibliography that you just produced. The fact that it's there and they know it's there engenders a higher degree of trust, and that's really important. So you see footnotes throughout this slide deck. You can do the same in your exhibitions really easily. It's a really neat and elegant way of doing it. Mainstream that inclusive content and never apologize for being inclusive. The more you mainstream it, the more people accept it. And museums are very powerful as a group in mainstreaming inclusive content. We do it with no apologies. Pace your work at the speed of trust, that calibration. It's going to be different for every individual walking through the door. Speed of trust. It's going to be difficult for some of your visitors, but don't preach to them and don't make them feel dumb. Be a forum for civil discourse, which is something that people are having a harder and harder time finding places for. And then step 10 is acceptance. Your visitors are human. You're human. There's going to be bias. There's going to be controversy, and you're not going to be 100% successful. Okay, so there's all my external sources. So they're all my footnotes. What I want to show you is where to find all the stuff that I just shared with you. And let's see here. So first, for that primer that we just went through, you go to my website, which is wilkeningconsulting.com. You'll see right here, there's a link. It'll take you to AAM's website where you can download it for free. The second piece, all those data stories, if you go still on my website, the link data stories, all of them are here. They are all freely downloadable PDFs. You can print them out. You can share them. I don't care. I want them out there. So here are, if you scroll down, I've got to find a better system for this, but for now, you scroll down, you'll find 2021 COVID audience research, data stories from the 2020 annual survey of museum goers. That further down, there's the COVID audience research that took place in 2020. And if you keep going, you will find all kinds of additional things going back to 2017. So we have about 4 or 5 years worth here. Okay, that was a lot. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. So Bethany, do we have some questions?
Thanks, Susie. That was great. There was a lot of information, but it's great that you've got that we can go back and look at it and think about it ourselves. So I highly encourage you to spend some time on her website and download those. We do have a question. One is there a self-study or survey an institution can do to determine where that museum lies on the spectrum of traditional to neoteric?
Oh, so with our visitors, as a self-study, I haven't created an instrument like that people can just go and take and put with their visitors yet. I have a really refined instrument that I use, and I use it in the annual survey of museum goers now. But it's no, I don't have as a self-study version yet. That is a great idea. Let me think about that.
Yeah, and I think they're talking about their museum's exhibits.
Oh, okay.
I may be wrong. I may be talking about their visitors, but I think the way I read the question was, how do we determine where our exhibits and programs
how are they
on the spectrum?
How would different audiences respond to that?
Yes.
Yeah. That is a great question too. I don't know of any resources for that. I mean, off the top of my head, I'd be like, well, there's different people who would do a really great job assessing that, but that would be then having to hire somebody to come in and do that. I mean, I think that's just a really good idea. All I can say is that's a really great idea to think about, what are those things that I would be, if I were walking through an exhibit or having a programming experience, what would I be looking for and saying, oh, that's inclusive. Oh, that language, so there's certain, key things like, are you talking about slaves? Are you talking about enslaved workers? that kind of, those language tweaks certainly would be little things like that. Yeah, no, I don't think we're there yet as a field and our research on this side of the inclusion coin. But that is certainly a great idea. I gotta think about that one.
Yeah, I thought it was a good idea too. So you talked a lot about the traditional versus the neoteric visitor. If a museum is doing a strategic plan or exhibit planning, do they need to identify which of those, where on that spectrum their target audience for that exhibit is going to be? Or is it more what their museum's values are?
Oh, I mean, I think where their values are maybe different than where their audience is, which might be the opportunity that the plan helps address as well. And so what scares me, I'm gonna say this is what scares me, is, and I'm trying to be really careful with how I word this, but I may word this wrong. I really want museums to think about both sides of this diversity work, inclusion work point, because if museums focus on broadening their audiences to underserved populations only, which that's great work, and I want them to be doing that. If they only do that without thinking about their traditional audience, what's likely to happen practically is that traditional audience will stop visiting, which means we lose our opportunity to help crack open the worldviews of that audience and actually affect more societal change. And it doesn't mean that we pander to a less inclusive mindset, because I don't want us doing that. But I want us thinking about that audience and how we can bring them along with us. Because if we want societal change, we have to change the values and have more people be more inclusive for society to be more inclusive. So I want to really be thinking about both sides of that coin and thinking very honestly about, where's our audience? If our audience right now is mostly more traditional white people, to be honest, then what are our opportunities to bring inclusive content to them in ways that might bring them on, along that path towards inclusion, and really valuing and thinking that's really important work. And that doesn't mean you're not going to be doing the other work as well to broaden and diversify your audience. But it's saying this is important too, but not how do we balance these things, and what is it that we can do best? And so I do have a client that mostly has a white traditional audience, and they're thinking through, like saying, we want to diversify our audience, but we see this as a great opportunity. And we're going to really kind of double down on this to open up these worldviews of our current audience as well. So I just want we tend to talk a lot about diversifying audiences, but looking and thinking about these less inclusive visitors is really harder. I mean, not harder, it's equally hard. And it's very uncomfortable because it makes us feel uncomfortable. I mean, I feel icky going through some of the research. I have to have all these little self-care things I have to do. I find fairy tales to be very helpful here. But I have a 7-year-old daughter. We go read fairy tales. It's great. But it's really uncomfortable work, because it's also then it's thinking about who our own families are, our own histories are if we're white. I think about the very non-inclusive, anti-inclusive, horrendous history my Georgia Native father's side of the family has, and think that through that, and that comes up in my own thinking as I deal with all this stuff. So it's very uncomfortable. It's very hard. It makes me feel icky, and it probably makes many of y'all feel icky. But if we don't do that work, if we, as a field that's majority white, who wants to be inclusive, doesn't do this uncomfortable work of saying how museums have been wrong in the past and how we're addressing it and how we're going to help make it better, how white people need to do things to make things better, because we're the ones who have erred in many of these cases, then we're not going to make progress. So it's both. And if I worded any of that wrong, it wasn't my intention. I was trying to word it's so hard to word. And yeah, I think it's taken in the spirit of mainstream or inclusion, but think about it's really complicated and nuanced.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a lot to think about. And yesterday we had
find your happy space of fairy tales or whatever it is.
Yeah. Yesterday our plenary also discussed the idea of museums are not neutral. And so that came up again here today. And I know, you know, me being from a national professional organization, you know, this is something that has been on our radar a long time.
Have a data story on it, so you can go dig up the data story. It's about.
Oh, good.
It's not very far down. Okay. I'm going to show y'all where it is really quickly. So on the data story pages, it's actually near the top, right here. Museums and neutrality. This is what audiences say about neutrality. Go read to your heart's content.
That's good. That's good help. I was going to say, you know, especially with maybe some small museums, small rural museums that might be on here, who their goal is to be neutral. Mm-hmm. But we were having discussions that didn't make it into the plenary yesterday, but when we did the pre-meeting with the plenary, we kind of talked about it, about every decision that's made in that museum is biased in some way, even if you don't think it is. Like, even if it's just a timeline of facts, what facts go in a timeline are affected by our biases. So I really liked what you said about, you know, put your biases on the table at the beginning of the process.
One person's neutral is somebody else's position. And so, you know, when you have somebody saying to the botanical garden, can't you just be a place of beauty? Well, that's a position that we're going to privilege beauty over climate change and the ramifications of climate change. I mean, just to use an example that has is less to do with inclusion, but has, you know, still has very much a political value being expressed there. So it's still a position. And I think we tend to get more neoteric audiences saying that kind of thing of, there is no neutral spot. Your neutral is that's a position to me, because that's not, I don't see that as neutral. And traditional audiences feeling like there is a place. So we get comments like history is like math. It's pure and simple. Leave it alone. And we all know it's not.
Yeah, history is messy.
Oh, it's so messy. And I'm coming out right now of research, intense research with educators across the country. So, you know, we are scared to deal with a lot of these issues because they're hard and they're messy and they're complicated. And now I'm just like, oh my gosh, I feel so, these teachers across the country, there are teachers out there who cannot even say the words Black Lives Matter. They can't even just say there is a movement called Black Lives Matter, because they've been told by their administrations not to. There are teachers who are scared of their jobs. And I know of one teacher who was fired because she did discuss the events of January 6th with her class the next day. So, you know, we're on the front lines, but so are teachers. And so coming out of that project, thinking about how do we help teachers who are on the front lines of history every single day? And I'm like, these teachers don't need our curricula, they need group therapy. And they also need advocacy tools that we as museums can support them with. So I mean, it's like we start adding on all these different demands and nuances. And wow, it is so hard and so complicated. I feel like the primer is just, you know, the teeniest little bit of a start.
Yeah, you're right. But it is a good place to start, especially if you're not thinking in those lines. So please explore Susie's website. We are actually a little over time.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I think this was a great conversation. It's good to see these concepts that we've been talking about over the last few years in that data-rich infographic that you've put together that really puts audience research and helps us see what our audiences are thinking about what we are talking about. So thank you, Susie.
My pleasure.
She's very open to an email, so feel free to.
I'm very approachable.
She is. We've known Susie for a long time at ASLH, and I appreciate her coming and speaking to the TAM fam.
And in real life at the ASLH conference, you buy me a cup of tea, I will sit with you for an hour. Just a cup of tea. That's it. That's all I need.
Yeah, and I'll give a quick plug. The ASLH meeting is in Little Rock, so there's you in West Tennessee, a couple of hours away.
There, so
yes, and we'll see Susie again. So thank you, Susie. Thank you to all of you who attended, and we look forward to seeing you this afternoon in some more of our concurrent sessions.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.